The officer walked into the courtroom with his chest puffed out, every step echoing his sense of authority and control. He wore his badge like a shield and his uniform like armor, convinced that it alone gave him superiority over anyone in the room. His eyes carried a certain smugness, the kind that came from years of believing his power could never be questioned. From the moment he saw the black man sitting at the defendant's table, his demeanor shifted into one of subtle disdain. He straightened his shoulders, squared his jaw, and exuded a confidence that came less from facts and more from assumption. To him, this was already a case won, a matter settled before it had even begun. The arrogance was not just in his stance, but in the way he glanced around the courtroom as though the outcome were obvious, as though the man before him were already beneath judgment. The way he addressed the judge carried a certain edge of entitlement, as if his words carried more weight simply because of his uniform. When asked to testify, he stepped up with a swagger, giving the impression that his account was unquestionable truth. Each word he spoke was layered with a tone that suggested superiority, not only over the defendant but over the entire process. He acted as though the law was on his side simply because he was the one who wore it on his chest. His smirk came and went, almost unnoticeable, but present enough for those watching closely to see his quiet satisfaction. He truly believed he had the courtroom in the palm of his hand, that his status would be enough to sway everyone listening. His arrogance also showed in the way he glanced at the black man, a fleeting look that carried more judgment than any spoken word could. It wasn't a stare of fear, nor even of suspicion, it was a look drenched in preconceived notions, built from stereotypes and assumptions he'd carried throughout his career. In his mind, this man didn't deserve the same respect, didn't deserve the same fairness, and certainly didn't deserve to challenge him. He thought of himself as untouchable, a figure of justice whose version of the truth was beyond question. The courtroom became his stage, and he played his role as though the ending had already been written. People in the audience could sense the air of superiority radiating from him. The tilt of his chin, the clipped tone of his answers, the way he positioned himself with his hands on the stand as though commanding authority, it all fed into the image of a man who thought the world bowed to his badge. He seemed to enjoy the tension, as though the silence of the room was an acknowledgement of his power. His testimony was delivered with calculated precision, but beneath it all lay an unmistakable smugness. Every word he spoke was heavy with the unspoken message, "I am the officer, therefore I am right." His arrogance wasn't just about the man in front of him, it was about the system he believed would always back him up. He carried himself as though the courtroom was just another extension of his patrol car, another place where his word was the final say. His confidence stemmed from years of knowing that his badge shielded him from questions, that people rarely doubted his account. This trial, to him, was not a battle, it was a formality. His attitude showed that he expected everyone to see things through his lens, to dismiss the defendant's story simply because he was the one opposing it. The arrogance seeped into even the smallest gestures. The way he adjusted his tie before speaking, as though preparing for a performance. The casual glance at his wristwatch, as if the entire proceeding was beneath his time. The faint smirk that tugged at the corner of his lips when the defense lawyer spoke, as though every word was nothing but wasted breath. These little moments painted a picture of a man whose pride towered over the facts, a man whose self-importance overshadowed the truth he was supposed to uphold. In his mind, this was not a fair trial but a stage set for him to reaffirm his authority. He assumed everyone else in the room saw things the way he did, that the black man before him was just another figure to be dismissed, another name to be processed and forgotten. He believed his story would go unchallenged, that his presence alone would silence doubt. It wasn't just arrogance, it was a complete blindness to the possibility that the courtroom might see something he didn't. His entire posture, tone, and behavior revealed a man convinced of his own dominance, a man so sure of the ending that he had already stopped listening to the beginning. ChatGPT said, the black man sat quietly at the defendant's table, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression calm and composed. He did not fidget, did not shuffle his feet, and did not allow the weight of the officer's testimony to rattle his demeanor. His silence carried a strength that words could not capture, a quiet resistance that seemed to unsettle those expecting fear or desperation. Where many would have looked down or shifted nervously under the officer's piercing gaze, he sat upright, his posture steady, his eyes forward. There was no anger in his expression, no visible frustration, only a patience that seemed deliberate, as if he knew something the others did not. His presence itself demanded attention, not because he forced it, but because he radiated a dignity that could not be ignored. The officer's words rolled off like water against stone, unable to break through the composure of the man listening. His calmness was not a mask, but a reflection of an inner certainty. It was the kind of presence that carried unspoken authority, as though he did not need to prove himself in the face of arrogance. Every glance toward him revealed a face untouched by panic. His eyes were sharp, steady, unwavering, giving no sign of intimidation. To those watching closely, it was evident that this man was not just another defendant, not someone who would crumble under the weight of false assumptions. Instead, his silence spoke louder than arguments, leaving the audience to wonder what story rested behind that stillness. The man's composure was evident even in the smallest movements. When he reached for a glass of water, he did so with deliberate calm, no hurried motions, no sign of nervous energy. When he shifted in his seat, it was measured and slow, as though each movement was intentional. His breathing remained even, his shoulders relaxed, showing no trace of fear in a place where many would have been consumed by it. The courtroom, filled with the officer's arrogance, seemed to contrast against the quiet power radiating from him. His very presence became a mirror, reflecting the overconfidence of the officer and exposing the imbalance between their demeanors. The defense lawyer occasionally leaned toward him, whispering something in his ear, and he would simply nod, acknowledging the words without breaking his calm. There was no sign of desperation in his eyes, no pleading look, no flicker of hopelessness. Instead, there was a steady confidence, the kind that seemed rooted in a truth waiting to surface. Those who observed closely began to feel that this man was not someone who had walked into that courtroom defeated. His silence suggested preparation, a quiet awareness that everything unfolding was only a prelude to what was yet to be revealed. Spectators in the courtroom found themselves drawn to his stillness. At first glance, he might have appeared ordinary, just another man caught in the machinery of the justice system. But the longer one looked, the harder it became to ignore the gravity of his composure. It was not arrogance, it was not defiance, it was strength. There was something in the way he carried himself that unsettled the narrative being spun against him. Where the officer projected authority through uniform and tone, this man projected it through an unshakable calmness that seemed to rise above the moment. When the officer glanced in his direction, expecting to see a man diminished under the weight of accusation, what he found instead was a steady gaze that held no fear. That calmness acted like a wall the officer's arrogance could not break. Each time their eyes met, it was as though the man was silently reminding the officer that power did not come from loudness, nor from symbols of authority, but from truth. The more the officer tried to assert dominance, the more the quiet composure of the man seemed to strip it away. His silence became louder than words, his calm stronger than any performance. Even the judge, who had seen countless cases pass through the courtroom, could not entirely ignore the impression this man gave. The courtroom thrives on energy, nervousness, anger, fear, but here was a man who brought a different kind of energy, one that shifted the room without effort. His posture, his breathing, his stillness, it all became a kind of quiet defiance, a reminder that not every story fits the assumptions made at first glance. His calmness suggested he knew where the truth lay, and that it was only a matter of time before it surfaced. Every whisper in the gallery, every shuffle of papers, every glance exchanged between spectators seemed to revolve around him. People began to sense that there was more to him than what was being said. His composure was not the composure of someone resigned, but of someone prepared, someone certain of what would come. Without uttering a single word, he commanded attention, leaving the audience waiting, wondering, and questioning what truth this man carried within his silence. The courtroom, once steady in its rhythm of procedure, suddenly felt like a living organism that had been jolted awake. When the black man's true identity was revealed, the silence that followed was unlike anything before. It was thick, palpable, pressing against every person seated in the room. The air seemed to hang heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. A single cough from the gallery echoed louder than expected, and the shuffling of papers sounded like thunder in the stillness. People were stunned not just by the truth itself, but by how completely it overturned everything they had assumed up to that point. Gasps rippled quietly through the benches, scattered but undeniable. Some spectators leaned forward with wide eyes, while others sat back in disbelief, their mouths slightly parted as if trying to form words that refused to come. Even the jury, trained to remain neutral, couldn't entirely mask their reactions. A few eyebrows arched in shock, some exchanged fleeting glances, and one or two shifted uneasily in their seats. It was a collective reaction, a wave of realization sweeping through the room, uniting people in shared astonishment. The judge, typically a pillar of composure, adjusted her glasses in a rare moment of hesitation. She leaned forward slightly, her gavel resting unused for once, as though even she needed a second to absorb the truth. For a moment, her stern expression softened, betraying the same human surprise that every other face in the room reflected. Though she quickly gathered herself, the faint pause before her next words was enough to signal the impact of what had just unfolded. Attention turned sharply toward the officer, whose arrogance had dominated the courtroom only moments before. His face betrayed him instantly. The smug confidence he had carried drained into a look of confusion, then disbelief, then something unsteady that bordered on panic. He opened his mouth slightly as if to speak, but no words came. The audience caught it, everyone noticed the sudden collapse of his composure. The very man who had strutted through his testimony with authority now looked smaller, diminished, as though the weight of the revelation pressed down on him more than anyone else. His stunned silence was louder than any outburst could have been. Whispers began to fill the gallery despite the judge's attempt to maintain order. They weren't loud, but they buzzed like electricity running through the room. People leaned toward each other, murmuring, their voices trembling with the urgency of disbelief. Questions were exchanged in hushed tones. Did you hear that right? Is it true? How did the officer not know? The quiet murmurs only heightened the tension, creating a backdrop of awe against the silence of those directly involved in the trial. The defense attorney's face remained calm, but there was the faintest glint of satisfaction in his eyes. He knew this moment was pivotal, knew the impact it carried. He glanced briefly at the jury, letting the weight of the revelation linger, not needing to add anything. The silence worked in his favor, amplifying the significance of the truth revealed. Every second that passed in that stunned atmosphere made the officer's earlier arrogance look more hollow, more exposed. The black man himself remained steady, his composure unchanged even as the courtroom reacted with astonishment. His calm presence became even more powerful against the backdrop of shock around him. He did not smile, did not gloat, did not acknowledge the gasps or whispers. He sat as he had before, dignified and patient, as though he had anticipated this very moment and was unshaken by the storm it created. His stillness only magnified the intensity of the reaction, while others scrambled internally to process what they had learned. He sat firmly rooted, a pillar among shifting sands. Some jurors avoided the officer's gaze entirely, their earlier confidence in his testimony visibly shaken. Others found themselves glancing again and again at the defendant, struggling to reconcile the quiet, composed man before them with the weight of the identity that had just been revealed. For them, the case no longer felt straightforward, it had become something larger, something that challenged their assumptions and demanded deeper reflection. Even the court clerk, usually mechanical in her duties, paused with her pen hovering just above the paper, frozen in the moment of disbelief. The stenographer's fingers slowed briefly over the keys, then resumed with careful precision, as if she recognized the gravity of capturing this revelation for the record. Every corner of the courtroom, from the benches to the front rows, bore witness to the stunned silence that stretched far longer than any normal pause should have. The officer shifted again, his jaw clenching, his hands tightening around the edge of the stand. His eyes darted briefly toward the spectators, then to the jury, then finally to the man he had underestimated so completely. The look he received in return was calm, steady, unshaken, and it struck him harder than any verbal rebuttal could. The silence between them was deafening, a chasm of truth that left him visibly rattled. In that moment, the balance of power in the courtroom had shifted entirely. The audience could feel it, the jury could sense it, and even the judge could not deny it. The stunned reaction was not just about learning who the black man truly was, it was about realizing how deeply they had all been swayed by surface assumptions. The courtroom had transformed, and nothing about its atmosphere would ever feel quite the same again. Bias is a strange thing. It often hides beneath the surface, unspoken, invisible, yet powerful enough to shape every thought, every assumption, and every action. In that courtroom, the officer's bias had not been announced aloud, but it had been present from the beginning. It lived in the way he looked at the black man, in the tone of his testimony, in the certainty with which he believed his words would be accepted without question. He did not need to say it outright, his arrogance was built upon a foundation of hidden prejudice. The revelation of the man's true identity ripped the cover off that foundation and forced it into the light for everyone to see. The silence that followed the revelation was filled with recognition. People in the audience began to piece together what they had just witnessed, realizing how differently the officer had carried himself because of who he thought the man was. His dismissive glances, his condescending tone, his smug assurance that the courtroom would side with him, all of it became clearer now. He had not been responding to evidence, nor even to truth, but to the assumptions he carried about race, about class, about status. His bias had driven his arrogance, and now it stood exposed in front of the very people he thought would support him. The jurors, too, felt it. Before the revelation, many had listened to the officer's testimony with the natural inclination to trust his badge, his uniform, his position of authority. But now, with the truth revealed, they began to look back at his words through a different lens. They remembered the sharpness of his tone, the subtle dismissals, the way he spoke of the defendant as though he were already guilty. Those behaviors, once overlooked as confidence, now read as prejudice. The officer had underestimated a man not because of facts, but because of who he thought that man was. His bias, hidden in the folds of arrogance, had been laid bare. The defense attorney did not need to shout it out. He simply let the silence linger, knowing the jury was already making the connections on their own. The officer's earlier demeanor now looked like a performance fueled by entitlement rather than truth. His certainty that his word would be accepted without question was not the mark of justice, it was the mark of bias. He had relied on a long-standing assumption that his position and his skin color gave him automatic credibility, and the revelation had shattered that illusion. The courtroom could now see the imbalance for what it was. Even the spectators, many of whom had walked into the courtroom expecting a simple proceeding, found themselves unsettled by what had been exposed. Their own reactions, their own assumptions, began to weigh heavily on them. Some realized that they, too, had made silent judgments when the black man first entered the room, thinking of him as a defendant before thinking of him as a person. The officer's bias had mirrored their own, and the revelation forced them to confront it. The courtroom was not only a stage for the trial but a mirror for everyone watching. The officer's body language betrayed him more than his words ever could. He fidgeted now, a sharp contrast to the swagger he had carried before. His eyes darted, avoiding the steady gaze of the man he had tried to belittle. His voice, once confident, trembled slightly when he spoke again, no longer carrying the unshakable authority it once had. Every twitch, every stammer, every defensive shift revealed a man scrambling to recover, but unable to hide the truth that had been laid bare. The courtroom no longer saw him as a flawless enforcer of justice, they saw him as human, fallible, and flawed by prejudice. The black man's calm composure stood in stark contrast to the unraveling of the officer. Where one carried arrogance, the other carried dignity. Where one relied on bias, the other relied on truth. The contrast became so sharp that it was impossible to ignore. The revelation had not only shifted the narrative, it had exposed the deeper truth of how people judge, how they assume, and how they let bias shape their view of others. The silence after the revelation became a lesson in itself, as if the courtroom collectively realized they had been complicit in allowing bias to go unnoticed until it was forced into the open. The judge's voice, steady and deliberate, cut through the tension as she called the court back to order, but even her words carried a weight they had not before. Her authority was the same, yet her tone revealed the recognition that something significant had just taken place. She knew, as did everyone else, that bias had been exposed, not just in the officer but in the very system that allowed such assumptions to take root. The courtroom was a microcosm of a larger truth, that hidden bias does not remain hidden forever, and when it is exposed, it forces everyone to confront the uncomfortable reality of its presence. The officer, once so sure of himself, now stood as a cautionary figure. His arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only the raw truth of prejudice unmasked. The jurors saw it. The spectators felt it. The defense attorney allowed it to linger. And the black man, steady and unshaken, sat as living proof that dignity can outlast arrogance, and truth can strip away the lies built on bias. Respect is not always demanded with loud voices or forced through authority. Sometimes, it is earned in silence, in composure, in the quiet endurance of truth. In that courtroom, after the arrogance of the officer had been stripped away and the hidden bias laid bare, what remained was the undeniable dignity of the black man who had carried himself with grace from the very beginning. The lasting lesson was not in the officer's downfall, but in the steady reminder that dignity, when held firm, commands respect in ways arrogance never can. The man's calm presence became the centerpiece of the room. He had never needed to raise his voice, never needed to shout down accusations, never needed to wear a badge or uniform to assert authority. His respect came from within, from the way he carried himself with patience and self-control even when he was underestimated. In a space where he had been misjudged, he chose not to let frustration dictate his actions. He understood that true strength was not in matching arrogance with anger but in allowing truth to reveal itself in time. That quiet dignity forced everyone in the room to reassess their own behavior, their own assumptions, their own measure of respect. The jurors, once swayed by the officer's confidence, now found themselves leaning toward the gravity of the man's composure. They saw that while arrogance crumbled when challenged, dignity remained unshaken. Every quiet nod, every steady breath, every patient pause became a silent testimony more powerful than any words. The revelation of his identity mattered, but what mattered more was how he had conducted himself before it was known. It showed that respect is not tied to titles or positions, but to character. The jurors could not escape that truth, and it lingered in their minds long after the words had been spoken. The spectators, too, carried the weight of the lesson. Many had walked into that courtroom with the same assumptions the officer carried, believing they knew the story simply by looking at the man seated at the defendant's table. But his dignity disrupted their assumptions, showing them the folly of judging too quickly. Respect is not owed to appearances or to symbols of authority, it is owed to the humanity and truth that every person carries. The longer they watched him, the more they understood that the strength he showed came not from reacting, but from choosing to remain unshaken. That choice earned him more respect than any outward display of force could have. Even the officer, who had walked in with arrogance, could not deny the lesson pressed against him. Though his pride fought to resist it, he felt the shift in power, felt the unspoken respect the man now commanded. He realized, perhaps too late, that his uniform did not shield him from truth, and his badge did not give him superiority over dignity. The man he thought he could dismiss stood taller without rising from his chair, and that quiet truth was a wound the officer could not cover. In the silence of that realization, the officer himself became a reluctant student of the lesson unfolding before him. The judge's gaze lingered on the man more than once, a subtle acknowledgement of the dignity he carried. She, who had witnessed countless cases filled with shouting, with pleading, with desperate attempts to sway, recognized the unique power of calm composure. Respect is not something that can be demanded in a courtroom, it is something that reveals itself when all else has been stripped away. What she saw in that man was the essence of dignity, and though her role required neutrality, the quiet respect she felt was undeniable. The black man did not seek pity, nor did he bask in the shift of perception. He remained steady, as he had from the beginning. That consistency became the true lesson: dignity is not conditional, it does not rise only when others acknowledge it, and it does not fall when others attempt to strip it away. It is carried regardless of circumstances, a constant reminder that self-respect precedes the respect of others. His presence alone taught that lesson more powerfully than any speech could. The courtroom, filled with people of different roles, left with a shared memory that would linger beyond the trial itself. They had witnessed arrogance collapse, bias exposed, and dignity prevail. They learned, whether consciously or not, that respect built on fear or authority is fragile, but respect built on dignity is unshakable. The black man had not forced the room to see him differently, he had simply remained himself, calm and composed, until the truth revealed what had always been there. It was a lesson that reached beyond the walls of that courtroom, one that applied not only to the people present but to the larger world outside. Dignity does not need permission, and respect is not something granted by those in power, it is something that grows naturally when truth and composure stand unwavering. In that courtroom, the quiet strength of one man became the lasting reminder that real respect cannot be taken, it can only be earned, and once it is earned, it cannot be forgotten.